Good afternoon, and thank you for virtually attending our Advanced Care Planning webinar. We are pleased that you have decided to join us as we attempt to stay as safe as possible during this pandemic and adjust to our new current way of living. I'm Beth Robinson, social worker and member services facilitator with Goodwin House at Home. We would like to welcome our Goodwin House at Home members, our Goodwin House residents, our Priority Club members, staff, students, and friends who are joining us today. We continue to move new residents into residential living apartments at both Goodwin House Alexandria and Goodwin House Bailey's Crossroads, as well as welcome new members who wish to age safely in their homes with Goodwin House at Home. If you have an interest in Goodwin House at Home or one of our life plan communities, or if you are a Priority Club member interested in moving within the next year, we urge you to call or email one of our senior sales associates or sales counselors. Their phone numbers and email addresses will be provided at the end of the webinar. Before we begin today, I would like to let you know that we will be recording the webinar and will send copies of the recording and the slides after the event. We hope that you will share the recording and slides with your family and friends. Also, we have designated time at the end of the presentations for questions and answers. So please submit your questions throughout the webinar by using the chat or question feature on the right side of your screen. As the number of COVID-19 cases and deaths continue to rise, we have all thought about what will happen if we are infected. With that thought, we encourage you to begin planning now and letting your loved ones know what your wishes would be. Even if you're not infected with coronavirus, you want your voice to be heard when someone else is caring for you or making medical decisions for you. Today, we will hear from attorney Nathan Kottcamp, who is founder and chair of National Healthcare Decisions Day, which is aimed to educate the public and healthcare providers about the importance of advanced planning. As a reminder, in the words of Mr. Kottcamp, there is no D in the word advanced when talking about your advanced directive or advanced care planning. Then you will hear from Dr. Farrah Daly, who is a neurologist, palliative care medicine specialist, and consultant to Goodwin House Hospice. Her practice is focused on supporting people living with advanced neurologic disease, and with that advanced, there is a D on that word. With that, I turn it over to Mr. Kottcamp to begin.
Thank you so much. Thanks everybody for joining us. I'm thrilled to be here with Dr. Daly. We're going to do our best to educate, not bore you. I know I'm a lawyer and that can be scary, but I'm going to do my best not to scare you too. So it's always a shame when I don't get to see folks in person when I'm presenting on this topic, but because it really is a personal topic, and as much as it's just fine and suitable in this day and age to be presenting virtually, it takes something out of it. So I want to recognize that from the outset. So as Beth indicated, we're going to be talking for the next few minutes about advanced directives. And you see there's no D at the end of advanced, although I'd like to think that anyone's advanced directive would be of advanced quality. So I'll just say that at the outset. What you see here is a compass. And I am fairly confident that the folks in the age cohort that are listening to this and watching it know what a compass is. You know that it is a wonderful tool. You know that it provides only limited information, but that limited information can literally save your life. It's not a GPS. It doesn't tell you every turn to make. It doesn't tell you how to sail across the ocean. It doesn't tell you all the details. That's how I like to think of advanced directives. Okay? It's not a roadmap. It's not a cookbook. Nobody's got a crystal ball. We can't lay this stuff down as sort of an ordered set of instructions for healthcare providers, because none of us can really predict exactly what's going to go on and how our health is going to unfold if we have a healthcare crisis. But we can, and we absolutely should, create an advanced directive, keeping in mind that it's very much like a compass. So if we tell our loved ones, when we tell our physicians, our north and south and east and west, we're able to chart a much better course. It may not be perfect, but it's a whole lot better than going out with no compass at all. So that's how I want you to think about this from a high level. I think one of the things that It's very frustrating for me as a lawyer. And I look at advanced directives, and I look at my own profession, and I look at the state of things, is that we, I think, have done a pretty horrible disservice with the way that advanced directives have been adopted across the various states, and the fact that they are very much a legal tool. And because they're a legal tool, with all these legal formalities, they get put into a special box of heightened requirements for making them valid and all these other things. But those end up deterring people from executing these documents, and they stand in the way. And luckily, we don't have it here in Virginia, but states that require a notary, for example, it's just an extra impediment to doing something as simple as sitting down, having a conversation with your loved ones, writing it down, and having that available if it's a health crisis. So hopefully that overview sort of sets the stage. So we'll turn to the next slide. And as I said, I'm a lawyer, so I got to talk a little bit about the law, but I'm not going to harp on this. Just very significantly is that the Patient Self-Determination Act was Congress's response to the United States Supreme Court recognizing that all Americans have a right to make advanced care choices. Simply that there's a lot of law that serves as at least one of the foundations for advanced care planning from a legal perspective, but it's only but so effective. This is really an exercise in having conversations, real heartfelt discussions with your loved ones. It really should take place around a living room or around a kitchen table or something like that. The legal formalities of creating the document should come last. You should do it, but really this is about a process. So that's really the key thrust of the legal requirement. So let's turn to the next slide. And we've already heard a little bit about this, but the law is not the reason. The reason that we do advanced care planning, the reason that we're investing our time in this presentation, and there's so many resources out there, is that it's just the right thing to do. The right thing to do for yourself because you are protecting and stating your wishes, so it gives guidance to your healthcare providers and your loved ones. But the evidence shows that it's beneficial for your loved ones. It takes some of the burden off of them. They don't end up living with the nightmare of wondering whether they made the right choice for their loved ones. So it really is a gift. We talk about it being a gift all the time. And I know that just demographically speaking, we're talking today to an older generation for the most part, but it's a misconception to think that advanced care plans are only for those that are older or have some sort of chronic disease or some issue, stroke or cancer, heart disease, or something like that. The reality is that they are valid, they are important, they are needed for adults of all ages. And regardless of your current health status, I mean, we all know of stories of that marathon runner who's in their late 30s who collapses and dies of a heart attack. Well, they might have needed an advanced care plan too. And the other thing is there's oftentimes a misconception that advanced care plans are only to be used to set forth requests or wishes not to have certain interventions. We think of this in many cases of, I don't want to be on a ventilator, or I don't want advanced life support technologies used on me. And that's fine. That's probably what the majority of advanced care plans set forth, so there's no ambiguity about it. But there's plenty of patients or individuals that want really aggressive care. And from an ethics perspective, it's just as important to be sure that the folks that don't want care aren't being given inappropriate care as it is to be sure that those who want as much as possible are actually getting it. So the next slide, please. So one of the reasons we're having this conversation, one of the reasons that so many of us put so much effort into this, is the fact that somewhere between a quarter, maybe a third at the most, adults have an advanced care plan. The numbers are really low, notwithstanding lots of initiatives. And evidence suggests that this is not particularly unique for folks that are in the hospital, in an ICU. Less than 50% in a study had an advanced directive, and more troubling is the fact that between 65 and 76% of physicians whose patients were in an ICU had an advanced care plan the physician didn't know that it existed. So we have a real disconnect there. So we all have a lot of work to do. I think it's incumbent upon the medical providers, but also upon patients and their families to be sure that they're each talking about this so that we don't really have any gaps. So next slide. Super quick, just simply, and you guys all have these slides, I believe, just that the evidence suggests that when you have an advanced care plan, cancer patient studies suggest you're more likely to get the care that you want. Next slide. This one I find very troubling. So Mayo Clinic, you may already know about it. It's literally one of the top medical institutions on the planet. And they did a study that showed that for this particular cardiac procedure, to put it bluntly, they're sticking a needle into someone's heart. Less than 50% of the patients that were undergoing this treatment, where the inherent risk is death right there on the table, had an advanced directive. And only a third of the ones that had an advanced directive talked anything about life-sustaining treatment preferences if something went wrong in that procedure. So again, here we are with the best of the best of the best, and even they are very much falling short. So we all just have to focus on this and make sure that these shortfalls are being made up. So next slide. So when folks like me and others, Dr. Daly, are looking at the scenario that we find ourselves in, we're trying to figure out what's going on. Why aren't people talking about this? You know, the mortality rate of human beings is 100%. So why aren't we talking about it? Well, I think a lot of it is we just don't want to talk about it. We don't have a good vocabulary in the United States for talking about death and disability things. So we end up being scared and squeamish and denial and confused. The next slide offers another look at what's happening, and that is the information disconnect. I mentioned this just a moment ago, but I think what ends up happening is that all the different players in healthcare interaction end up feeling like it's somebody else's job. Physicians think that patients are going to raise the issue when it's appropriate. They're not going to interrupt in the meantime. Nurses think it's the doctor's job. Doctors think it's the nurse's job. Patients are waiting for their families to jump in. The families are waiting for the patient to. You can see how this is just this. It goes around and around and around, and the topic just ends up not getting discussed at all, which is really, really tragic, because the simple fix is having every one of these characters take one giant step forward, and they're all talking about it. And it's easy enough to say, no, it's in the document, we've talked about it, we're good to go, as opposed to, no, we've never talked about it, and we don't know what this person wants. And I've seen that sad situation happen all too often. So the next slide. Hopefully at the very beginning, you heard me talking and sort of lamenting the fact that advanced directives are so legalistic and they require all these legal formalities and special forms and execution rules and things like that. So I think what ends up happening is within the general public, we have this this perception of advanced directives, advanced care planning is this really complicated maze of things that you're supposed to do. And that's really unfortunate, because the reality is very, very different from that, at least with respect to us in Virginia. We're very lucky. As we're going to see the next slide, it takes functionally very, very, very little to create an advanced directive in Virginia. You don't need a special form. You don't need to use a lawyer. You don't have to get it notarized. Anybody, so it can be family, the person you're naming as your agent, or even a healthcare provider can serve as your witness. You do need to. So all it takes, literally you could do this on a cocktail napkin, not that I recommend that, but as long as you state your wishes in writing, some coherent fashion that we're going to understand what you're trying to tell us, you sign it and you get two witnesses, you've got an advanced care plan. Very, very significantly in Virginia, you can have your advanced care plan address any sort of care. It doesn't have to be end-of-life care. It could be mental health care. It could be your preferences regarding blood transfusions, amputation, certain classes of drugs. All that kind of stuff is absolutely fair game for an advanced directive. And if you have particular needs or desires, please put it in writing so we'll know what to do. We want to give you the right care. Next slide. We did a major overhaul of the law back in 2009. So if you've got one, if If you have an advance directive, it's older than 2009, you might want to pull it out and just check and see how well it's doing. I won't go through these in detail, they're there for you, but I just wanted to indicate that the law is evolving, maybe slowly, but it is evolving. So next slide. One of the things we find people are reluctant to do with respect to advanced directives is to sign one because they think as soon as they sign it, they're going to be essentially waiving their right to make decisions for themselves, and it's just not the case. It does take two physicians to determine that somebody's capable of making decisions. And as the next slide is going to also show us, just a single diagnosis does not make an advance directive effective. So we see this all the time with Alzheimer's. We just heard a moment ago that early stage Alzheimer's or dementia, patients may be able to handle 95% of their own affairs. But what ends up happening is people will see Alzheimer's written as a diagnosis in the medical record, and all of a sudden they assume the person can't make any decisions for themselves. So that's what oftentimes happens in practice. It's not supposed to happen that way. So if you are sort of advocating for yourself or for a loved one, just know that a single diagnosis does not, in and of itself, render somebody incapable of making decisions. Next slide. So one of the things that also keeps people from executing advance directives is that they're going to be worried about being stuck with the document. It's actually easier to undo a advance directive than it is to create one in the first place. You do a signed, dated writing, you physically destroy it, so you throw it in the shredder or burn it up or whatever. You can direct somebody else to do a cancellation for you if you're having trouble writing, or if you're paraplegic, quadriplegic, whatever the case may be. And you can do an oral revocation if you state it for your healthcare provider. You'll note one kind of quirky difference here from 2 slides ago, which is that to revoke an advance directive, you're technically supposed to date it. But I never said you have to date an advance directive in the first place. I want you to date it. Please date it. The reason to date it is that if you do decide to revoke it, and hopefully when you do, you're then going to replace it with a new one, we'll know which one's the current advance directive. One other caution, advance directives are perfectly valid in electronic form, in photocopied form, and original form. So what you really want to do is create your document and share it with your loved ones, bring it to the hospital, give one to your primary care physician. That means that when it comes to revocation, if you decide to do that, physical destruction is a really bad idea. So simply putting the original one through the shredder or tossing it on the fireplace doesn't do you much good, because you've got 5 copies floating around with your children and physicians and others. So you're much better off keeping it a written declaration of revocation and sharing that with your loved ones and physician and others that need to know. Next slide. So we talked about this a few minutes ago, but the way that this works, it's that pecking order. It's a hierarchy of decision makers, starting with a guardian. Very few people have those. Spouse. A couple important things to point out there is that a spouse is a spouse unless a divorce action is filed. We all know people who are quote unquote legally separated. That is meaningless for the purposes of advanced care planning. So depending on the nature of the separation situation, it could be really, really, really important for someone to be naming their agent expressly. And then the real problem comes in for every one of the other categories, because you have the situation of multiples, and you are supposed to follow the wishes of the majority. Very hard to do if you're dealing with 2 children. Also, the simple reality is when you got 3 children, for example, it's really 2 against 1. It's one wants one thing, one wants another thing, and one wants a third thing altogether. So that's how this can be a real mess. And it's also one of the reasons why I discourage people from formally naming 2 children in an advance directive as their agent. It seems like a good idea at the time, but it's a recipe for disaster. And the way to work around that is you name one and you say that that person has to consult with the other decision maker to sort of balance everything out. Next slide. Here is a link that the website for the Virginia Advanced Care Directives Registry. It's a free registry where you can scan and put your advanced directive so that it can be available no matter what facility you present to. And there's also a bunch of resources on that website, so I encourage you to check it out. Next slide. Communicating with decision maker, there's so much confusion about HIPAA. Just know that if you are named as the agent, healthcare providers they are required to share health information with you in order for you to do your job as a healthcare decision agent. Next slide. I want to point out very quickly, I know I'm trying to be mindful of time and some of the technological hiccups that we endured, so sorry about that. Just know that a DNR, a do not resuscitate order, is a medical order. You can't make one yourself. So you'll occasionally see these little things floating around in the news or on the internet about people who have literally tattooed do not resuscitate across their chest and things like that. Love the spirit of that. I don't like the fact that it's not going to work if you end up having a heart attack and EMS comes. It has to be in the form of a physician's order. And in Virginia, those can be done in the facility, or they can be done with what's called a durable do not resuscitate order, or DDNR, or it's called a post form. So next slide. Post is sort of the next step of advanced care planning. It's taking an advanced care plan and translating it to physician's orders. So we're not going to spend too much time, but just know that that document is out there. It does count as a durable do not resuscitate order, and it does not replace advanced care plans. Next slide. Skip that slide. All right, so almost done. So it was mentioned earlier that I'm the founder and chair of National Healthcare Decisions Day. That the event occurs on April 16 every year. Very intentionally selected the day after tax day, thanks to Ben Franklin reminding us that nothing in life is certain but death and taxes. And it's an event where we're trying to encourage all sorts of organizations, healthcare, legal, financial planning, religious organizations, to just focus on advanced care planning and do it all on the same day. Our website is nhdd.org. We have all sorts of free information, and I would strongly encourage you to follow links there. And there are links for advanced directives in all the 50 states, some videos, and some other things. So just to point out, as you may know, I was actually working on my taxes last night. We had a second tax day in 2020 thanks to COVID, and it's July 15th. So we're doing a NHDD 2.0 this year on July 16th. So if you don't have an advanced directive, hopefully we've inspired you with this presentation today. Mark your calendar, make July 16 a day that you do your own advanced directive and you talk with your loved ones about it. Encourage them to do one as well. It doesn't matter your age, your current health status, as I mentioned, this is important for everybody. So next slide. So again, on July 16 and then April 16 next year is a great time to revisit your advanced directive. Has anything changed? Has addresses, contact information? Has somebody that you named as an agent died? Any of these things, make sure it goes up and down the generational line, and then lead by example. Tell others that you're doing it. Encourage your children to do it. Encourage your friends to do it. You don't have to tell them what your particular wishes are. Just tell them that you went through the exercise and speak with others about it and share the resources. So I just ask you to do that. It's a grassroots event, so hopefully you can spread the word. So I think the last slide is next. Yeah, just simply that those resources, although it's technically April 16 and July 16, those free resources are available to you throughout the year. So sorry again for my my Wi-Fi failure. I hope it wasn't too disjointed to have us flip the order. But I'm thrilled to have you guys all with us today. And if there's anything I can do to help you, please don't hesitate to reach out.
What I'm going to try to talk about is the concept that even if you don't think that you have an advanced care plan, you actually do. Everyone has an advanced care plan. It's just that if you haven't put any personal work into the advanced care plan, you basically have the generic advanced care plan, which any resident of the state of Virginia would have. You're going to have an automatic process in the event that you can't represent or make your own decisions. And it's important to know what that generic plan is, so that if it's not something that represents your own personal values, your own personal north, south, east, and west, as Mr. Kottkamp said, then you should really put some work into making your own custom plan. Go ahead, Katie, to the next slide. Okay, so I'm going to try to illustrate some of these concepts through a hypothetical case that I made up of Mr. and Mrs. J. So Mr. and Mrs. J live in an independent apartment. Mr. J has moderate Parkinson's disease and Mrs. J is healthy. Mr. J needs help with a few things, and Mrs. J has been able to do the things that he needs help with. They haven't required any professional caregivers or anything like that. And they have two daughters who are both grown. One lives close to them and the other one lives a plane ride away. There's a significant age difference between the two daughters. And Mrs. J says that her two daughters are very different people, that they've had a few significant arguments in the past, but that in general they're not close, but cordial. They have different ways that they communicate, and that's led them into some arguments over time. And you can imagine that drawing is maybe when the family was younger and the two daughters one was still a baby, but now they're grown, and Mr. and Mrs. J are older and starting to face the issues that we're talking about today. Let's move on to the next. So unfortunately, I have to make the story be a worst case scenario so that you can think through what these issues would be. Mrs. J dies unexpectedly in her sleep. And this is kind of a common scenario that families find themselves in, where there's one family member who's been relatively less healthy, and that's the one everyone worries about. And then it's actually the more healthy partner that ends up having a sudden event happen that changes things. So around the time of Mrs. J's death, Mr. J seems appropriately sad, maybe a little bit overwhelmed. He's not exactly sharp in conversations, but no one thinks much of it because something major has just happened and he's grieving. But over the next few months, his daughters start getting calls from the staff. They hear that he's fallen in his apartment. They hear that he's had a confused episode. The clinic calls and says that they have noticed that when they checked his pill box, it looks like he's not taking his medications appropriately. And then maybe he has another fall. So these events start snowballing, and the staff start to suggest to Mr. J's daughters that he might need to make some changes to his living situation. Next. So this is a really sad and stressful time for both Mr. J and both of his daughters. And the issue is that based on the planning that Mr. and Mrs. J have done prior to this time, they had the ability to make this situation maybe a little bit better or to make it maybe a little bit worse. And that's what we're going to explore today. So the objectives are that towards the end of this presentation, you're going to understand the difference between generic advanced care plan or custom advanced care plan in the state of Virginia in particular, and how you can use an advanced care planning process to anticipate problems in your future, to plan for them, and to create guidance that's intended to decrease stress on your family. Next. There is some evidence to support advanced care planning in the medical literature, and I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but one is that one study showed that a person is more likely to have care consistent with their wishes if advanced care planning has actually been discussed with a physician, rather than solely creating it with family caregivers or through legal help. There is also less stress, anxiety, and depression in surviving relatives if advanced care planning was in place prior to the time of death. There is less emotional distress leading up to the end of life for people who have put advanced care planning in place. And the next slide has a few more studies. Now this one I think is really important. This first bullet point here study by Denning in 2016 showed that family members of people with dementia were wrong up to a third of the time about making medical decisions. The way that they studied this was they had people who had just mild dementia very early on in the process where they were still primarily clear and could think about hypothetical situations about what they would want. And they presented both the person with a new diagnosis of dementia and their family member with hypothetical situations and said, they asked the person with the disease, what would you want in this situation? And they asked the family member, what do you think your family member would want in this situation? And actually, up to a third of the time, the family members had a different idea about what their loved one would want. And then the next two bullet points are studies about neurological diseases. Again, because I'm a neurologist, that's my area of focus. The main point of those two is that a lot of times in a neurological disease, even at the time of diagnosis, the person who is receiving the diagnosis, their decision-making capacity might already be impaired at the time that they receive their diagnosis. Half of people with brain tumors already have impaired decision-making capacity when they find out they have a brain tumor because of the nature of the way the disease affects them. And when people have strokes, end-of-life decisions are almost exclusively made through surrogate decision makers. Next slide. Okay, next slide again. So we're going to talk about how we can make an advanced care plan. And Katie, you can advance. So advanced care plan has two main parts. The first part is who is the surrogate decision maker or proxy decision maker, meaning who makes decisions for you in the event that you cannot. And the second part is a general description of your ideas about your care for when you cannot make your own decisions. And again, as Mr. Kottcamp was saying, this is like a compass. This is guidance for your future surrogate decision maker. It's not necessarily prescriptive. It does not handle every situation, but it gives them a sense of what your priorities and values are so that they can make good decisions on your behalf. It gives them a framework in which to operate. So we're going to focus on, thank you, Katie, we're going to focus on the first part first. Who is a surrogate decision maker? So what about Mr. J, right? If he had not put any advanced care planning in writing, had not named any surrogate decision maker, who does the state of Virginia say his surrogate decision maker would be, his generic decision maker? And Katie, just advance way down these bullets. They might come up all at once, but you can populate the whole list. Good, thank you. And stop there. So this is when Mr. Kottkamp does his part, he'll talk about this in more detail. But this is the hierarchy as defined by the state of Virginia of who makes decisions if there is no designated decision maker. So if you look down this list, a court-appointed guardian is first, spouse is second, and then we get to adult children, which is where Mr. J would be right now. So his adult children would bear decision-making responsibility for him. And then the question is, well, which one? He has two daughters and they don't get along so well. And the issue is that they both have equal decision-making rights and responsibilities. They basically have to agree on the plan of care. Let's advance. Okay, so what happens if these two daughters have to agree on the plan of care? They have two daughters, right? We're remembering what we learned about them. One lives nearby, the other lives far away. They have a cordial but not close relationship. They fought a few times. What problems can we anticipate in their decision-making together? Go ahead and click that, Katie. Keep going, populate the list. So that's good. So some issues might be distance. There's one of them cannot necessarily very easily get back and forth. Sounds like from their history that they might have different approaches to problems or different needs in terms of communication and preferences. So if you think about two people like that, how hard will it be for them to agree on each part of the plan of care? Possibly pretty hard. Go ahead and advance. So if we just hypothetically play this out, what could happen? now maybe the local daughter has been more involved day to day, and she really thinks she should be the decision maker. But the daughter who's further away, she loves her parents just as much, and she feels that not only does she have the responsibility, but also the right to weigh in, and state of Virginia agrees. And they disagree about what is the right thing to do for Mr. J. Maybe his health starts to decline, and each time he gets hospitalized, the two daughters fight about what should be happening. As his health worsens over time, they fight more and more times because more and more decisions need to be made, and their relationship feels worse and worse. And as he approaches the end of his life, the medical plan is disjointed because they're always distracted by the argument between the two of them, and they never really get a chance to step back and see the big picture. Again, this is a worst case scenario, but this is a hypothetical situation that's a combination of things that I, as a doctor who cares for people close to the end of their lives, I see this kind of situation over and over again. Advance, please. So what if Mr. J and Mrs. J had put in some thought into a custom decision maker? If they had really thought this through, they might have thought, this will be hard for our daughters. We want to make things easier for our daughters, and this is going to be tough. They shouldn't have to make decisions together. And so they might find a tool. And both Mr. Kottkamp and I will have references for some tools you can use. This one that I have put on this slide is from the American Bar Association. And basically there's a list there of 10 different things that make a good surrogate decision maker. I'm not going to read them all, but just for example, first of all, do they meet the legal requirements? Would they be willing to speak on your behalf? Are they able to separate their own wishes from your wishes? Do you trust them with your life? And so on and so on. And you could, on this tool, it's basically a worksheet. Mr. and Mrs. J could have put their two daughters there, and maybe also a friend, and kind of gone through these questions and checked off who would really best serve them as a surrogate decision maker. Something they could have done. And if they had, maybe the situation would be easier. So these are just some pitfalls of the generic decision maker. Meaning, like, if you're in one of these situations, it's especially important to think that you need to have a designated custom decision maker. If you're the parent of children who do not get along, it's important to have a designated decision maker. If you're single, never married, don't have any children, and maybe you're closer to your friends than you are to your blood relatives, you probably want to get it written down who your surrogate decision maker is as somebody who knows you well. If you're in a long-term relationship but not married, that would be an important time. If you're in a second relationship and there's maybe a strained relationship between earlier parts of your life and later parts of your life, that's an important time. And if there's a strained relationship already in place, people who do not get along with their children, unfortunately, or people who their next of kin is a cousin and they really have never gotten along, that would be an important time to name someone else. Next. Now, in the second part of the advanced care plan, this is where you're giving your guidance, your north, south, east, and west. Next. So it's important to understand, if you don't give that guidance, what is the generic plan for medical care when things start to go wrong? And I'll tell you, the generic plan for medical care, oh, can you go back to that last one? Unless you're secretly telling me that I need to hurry up. Just break in and tell me if I need to hurry up. So the generic plan for medical care is to prolong life at all costs. It is literally do everything to prolong life. If you show up in an emergency room, you show up in a hospital, and you're not able to represent, you're not alert enough to represent your own decisions, the default is prolong the life, act first, think second. And that's important. That's the way it's got to be, because in that situation, you have to act quickly. But it's important. A lot of people think that do everything means that the healthcare team is going to do everything that is reasonable or everything that makes sense in the overall situation. But that's not true. In that moment, the healthcare team does not have the opportunity to step back and look at the big picture, and they don't know you from another person. And so the default is prolong life. That's at least how it is here in the United States. Now you can go on, Katie. So within the medical part of the advanced care plan, you can do a basic job, of putting together a custom advanced care plan. You can do a little bit better, or you can do what I'm calling best. Basic would be writing down some of your values and wishes on a state-specific advanced care planning form. Better would be to think actually about your own health problems. Think about what are the likely future problems in your particular situation and write down expanded ideas about those things. And the best thing is to do that, plus, most importantly, have repeated conversations with your person who would be your surrogate decision maker and revisit it every once in a while. Now we can move on. So on this slide, you'll see the basic advanced directive, advanced care plan from the state of Virginia. And the website is right here on the page. www.caringinfo.org is where you can find this for free if you don't have one already. Basically, these are some screenshots from the actual document. There's instructions for if I have a terminal condition, and there's specific instructions if I am in a persistent vegetative state. Now, go on, Katie, to the next slide, please. So the problem with this basic advanced care plan, which is better than nothing, mind you, better than nothing. But the problem with it is it leaves a big gap. So Katie, there's animations, maybe 3 clicks on this slide. Let's have all the arrows populate. Great. Yeah, populate all those little arrows. I think there's 6. Good, perfect. So what you have here is, this is a diagram of a sunset. And the problem with basic advanced care planning is that you have someone, you know, prior to the sunset of their life is making decisions and hypothetically thinking about the end of their life and the care that they want. It's good that they're doing that. And in basic advanced care plan, they're really making plans only for the immediate end of life care. And that is really hard to define. So, you know, it leaves a big gap, that whole blue square in the beginning, in the middle of the sunset, in between kind of like when the sky is just getting beautiful and when you have a little flash of green right before the sun is set for the day. That there's a ton of decisions that need to be made during that time. And a basic advanced care plan, advanced directive from the state of Virginia does not address all of that in between. Next slide. So, but it is better than nothing. So say that Mr. and Mrs. J have done that. They named their decision maker. They did a good job and they picked one daughter as their decision maker. They and they discussed it with the other daughter so that there's no fighting at the time of death. And then they do a basic advanced care plan, which is better than nothing. But then what decisions are facing his daughter over upcoming years? You know, the decisions they're facing are, does Mr. J need to move out of his apartment? How aggressive should his medical care be as he is less and less independent over time? Does it make sense for him to have CPR if he suddenly gets sicker? Does it make sense for him to keep going back to the hospital if he reaches a point where the hospital doesn't seem to be restoring him to any greater level of independence? Do his medical treatment support his quality of life? None of that is addressed by the basic advanced care plan. Next slide. So they could do a little bit better. And the way they could do a little bit better is by thinking about their specific health problems. So Mr. and Mrs. J could have asked their neurologist what to expect of the future with Parkinson's disease. What problems are going to come up for me? What do I need to be prepared for or have a plan for? So that they could think about how the disease was going to change over the future and at what point on that spectrum, if at all, there would be a point where they would not want to keep doing aggressive things to try to live longer. Is there a point where it would become more important to them to focus on the quality of any given day over the quantity and to try to give some guidance about what that threshold would be? They could have done that. And there are some specific tools out there specifically for neurologic disease that can be helpful, but a lot of times you just need to speak to your physician or healthcare provider and say, this is what does my future look like? What are the most common problems for someone like me? Next slide. Here's another tool to expand on your wishes. is the 5 wishes form, which is acceptable, meets legal advance directive requirements in most states, including Virginia. So 5 wishes is a way of expanding and adding to the decision-making guidance in between, in that middle part of the sunset. And the next slide. This is one sort of unique advanced care planning tool, which is called Dementia Directive. And it's specifically an advanced care planning document to guide decision-making through the course of the disease with dementia. It's available online. And if you look at it, I do suggest if you're looking at any specific tool, again, speak also to your physician about it and help them sort of guide you through it, because none of these tools are perfect, and they all warrant some additional explanation. Next slide. So what if Mr. J had a custom medical advanced care plan? Maybe then his decision-making daughter, first of all, she would have guidance. She would know that north, south, east, or west, and be able to use that to frame up her decisions for her father. She would also have those written wishes to help explain things to her sister anytime her sister didn't understand why a decision was being made in a certain way. She would be able to reference the document and say, I'm trying to do what he wanted. It's not necessarily what I want, but I'm representing what he said he wanted, and we can do this together. So it's a way of helping their relationship. You know, it's not to say their relationship is necessarily going to get better, but it's probably not going to worsen. They're also not distracted by arguments as things change over time, so that they're always able to reorient to the big picture. And they can put their energies into togetherness and support, if not with each other, individually with their father. So because they're not always being distracted by having to make decisions together without guidance. Next slide. We're close to the end of my stuff. And this, Mr. Kottkamp, hopefully if he's able to come on, is going to talk more about the Conversation Project website, where there are a lot of tools that actually can give other suggestions, like how to have a conversation with your decision maker, how to write a letter about what your wishes are. There's a lot of good examples and tools on this website. Next slide. Then finally, revisit your plan periodically once you put it in place. Another great physician that I have worked with over time, I've heard her say that your advanced care plan is like your evening wear. It's not something you wear every day. It's not something you think about all the time, but you do occasionally have to get it out of the closet, try it on, and see if it still fits or if it needs an update. Is it still in style? Does it still match what you want? So advanced care plan, revisit periodically like your evening wear. Next slide. So again, your purpose in doing this is to increase clarity, reduce uncertainty, decrease stress in your family members, help your family members be in a good position to maintain their relationships, and create better opportunities for coordinated care and closure at the end of life. Next. So here are the resources for you. Remember that you have an advanced care plan already. It's either a generic one or it's a custom one. And I would encourage everyone to really put the effort into some custom planning. When you have the slides, you will have these tools here are the ones that I referenced in my slides: Conversation Project, Bar Association, and Dementia Directive.
Well, thank you, Dr. Daly and Mr. Kottkamp. This is really wonderful education and truly powerful reminders of how quickly things can change in life and how easy it is to make your wishes known in Virginia. So now you've generated a lot of questions, so we will begin our question and answer session. We do want you to know that we likely won't get to all of your questions, but we will be providing written answers to your questions that are not answered during this webinar. So the first question is, what should I do if I do not have a trusted family member or friend to name as medical POA? And is it enough to have an advance directive on file at my primary care physician's office, or do I need to provide to all my physicians?
I wonder, Mr. Kottkamp, if you would want to talk about, this sounds like a good scenario where someone might engage a professional surrogate decision maker, like engage an elder care attorney to be their surrogate decision maker.
Yeah, I mean, keep in mind your decision-making agent does not have to be a relative for sure. It could be a friend, it could be a neighbor. I've seen plenty that name a clergy member or rabbi. Some folks that live in a facility will name the administrator of the facility if they're willing to do that. I wouldn't just name someone without having the conversation to be sure that they're willing to accept the role. But there are actually professionals out there that market these services as being your advocate. So some of them are attorneys, some of them just offer the service. And so if you're truly without anyone in your life, which I hope is not the case for anybody, you can hire away for these specific services. And in terms of where to have the copies, you know, the simple rule is the more diverse the group that has your advance directive, the more likely it is to be honored. So I would give it to the physician. I would give it to, if there's a particular hospital where you are likely to end up, you can send it to them or deliver it to them, and they should put it in their files and then put it in the registry. And that's probably the best of your options.
Okay. Can you add assisted termination of life to an advance directive?
That's a great question. So in the state of Virginia, assisted termination of life is not legal, or medical aid in dying, not currently legal. So here in Virginia, I'd say you could include your thoughts about that in your advance directive, which would give people guidance in terms of your priorities, but that's not something that would actually be able to happen under the legal structure in this state. But it still actually gives people a lot of, for me as a physician, when I hear that someone has been interested in that in the past, it's a gateway into a conversation about what has been important to them and how they feel about quality of life, to feel that strongly. It's just not something I can act on.
Yeah, I'll echo that and just simply say you can stick anything you want in your advance directive. It doesn't necessarily mean that you're going to have it honored. But the other consideration is if you really do feel strongly about that, I would frankly encourage you to put it in. It's a subject area that is across the globe an evolving situation. There are other states. I can't imagine Virginia being at the leading edge of things, but you just never know. So your advance directive is valid until you revoke it. So if you create it now, we change the law in 10 years, and you live another 20 years, it may be precisely a good thing to have in there now, and you don't have to revisit it later. So just know that it won't be honored in the meantime.
Okay, and speaking of states, if I complete my advance directive in Virginia, is there reciprocity for other states?
Yes, there's reciprocity in all the 50 states. It doesn't mean that facilities and providers are very knowledgeable about those rules. They screw it up all the time. I can't tell you how many times I've had to deal with hospitals in North Carolina that reject our Virginia advance directives because they aren't notarized, which is required for North Carolina law, but not for Virginia. But if you can get the attention of a social worker or somebody in administration, they should be able to work it through and get your advance directive honored.
If you have a trust that includes an advance directive care plan that needs to be updated, can you do it virtually during this time, or does it have to be in person with the attorney?
It depends on what you're doing. If you are swapping out content, if you're going to change your agent, for example, the law is still not very clear as to what you can do. One of the best things you could do is actually videotape the whole thing. You know, everyone's got video on their phone, and so you can execute it and have it be coupled with video. If you're really just making like a ministerial change, like if somebody's phone number or address or email address that for contacting your named agent changes, that's just something you can do without having it witnessed. But the simple answer is it's better to get the witnesses. Remember, anybody can be your witness, so it shouldn't be that difficult. But unless there's some dire reason why you can't have contact with anyone whatsoever, I would still encourage it to be in writing.
Okay. We'll take two more questions. One is, would you address advanced directives for COVID-19 specifically?
Go for it, Doc.
Yeah, there are a few examples of COVID-specific advanced care planning going around, and as Mr. Kottcamp's been saying, you can create an advanced directive with any content that you want, and it does continue to guide decision makers and can be helpful. The thing that I have been speaking with people that I look after about when they're talking about specific advanced care planning for COVID is that in my mind, really, COVID is bringing this issue to the forefront for a lot of people. But for the most part, I would say people should really be considering their overall health status and their medical interventions globally, not necessarily just specific to COVID. And the thing that COVID is changing is it's increasing the burdens of being hospitalized, in that, you know, and under normal circumstances, if you're having a health condition, you could kind of assume that you could be hospitalized and sort of work it out as the process unfolds, and your family will be able to be there at your side, whichever direction things go. And right now, during the COVID pandemic, most hospitals are not allowing any visitors, and so that's what's happening, is that the burden of being hospitalized normally is here, and right now during COVID it's here because the burden of being hospitalized now also includes being isolated from your family and possibly being, you know, alone or not being able to see or interact with other people. And so that threshold has changed. But whether you're being hospitalized for COVID or being hospitalized for some other condition, a pneumonia that's not COVID, or a bladder infection or something else, is I don't see those decisions as really different. Does that make sense? You guys truth check me and see if I explain that in a way that makes sense.
No, you're spot on. The one thing that I do encourage folks to do, and I've always encouraged folks to do, is avoid definitive language like always and never. There are plenty of people out there that have advanced directives that are influenced by experience that they've seen with loved ones, you know, living out their last months or days, whatever it is, on a ventilator, and they're like, that's never going to be. I don't ever want to be on a ventilator. The use of a ventilator for COVID, for example, is very different from that, or at least often is very different from that. It's an emergency intervention. It's not anticipated to be in place until the end, you know, some long drawn out thing. So if you're one of those folks that has that advanced directive, you might want to revisit that language and say, you know, I'd be willing to be on a ventilator for a very short duration. I consider short to be X number of days or something like that. But just be careful of always and never, that they can come back to haunt you in ways that you just can't anticipate when you think it makes sense at the very beginning.
And so because of time, our final question will be, what is the success rate for resuscitation?
Really important question. I wonder, everybody could take a minute as they're listening and think, what's their instinct? What do they think is the success rate for resuscitation, which is, you know, in the event that someone stops breathing and their heart stops beating, emergency response comes and starts CPR, what is the success rate? So if everybody just takes a second and thinks, well, what's my gut instinct? What do I think the answer is going to be? And it's out in the community, the success rate is generally quoted at less than 2%. And success is generally defined as surviving the initial event and does not include surviving to beyond discharge from the hospital. And so, you know, the rate of success in terms of actually surviving and continuing to live well is exponentially smaller than quoted success rates. It's not like on TV.
All right, so just a reminder to our audience that we will, with all of your questions, we will provide written answers. We have so many questions, and that means that the two of you have truly had some thought-provoking conversations. So just as some final words here, Goodwin House at Home and the Goodwin House Life Plan communities will continue to offer educational webinars. We have a few on the screen now that we encourage you to register for. Dr. Daly, Kottkamp, thank you again for sharing your time and your expertise today. Your education is very much appreciated. To our virtual audience, thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to working with you as Goodwin House at Home members or as residents of one of our Life Plan communities. Thank you.